It's another week, another interview. I'm here this week with James Desborough from Postmortem Studios. He's a game designer, tabletop primarily, a writer, including a writer of erotica. And like me, he tends to get in trouble for things he says online. James, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Liana.
Yeah, now
Good to talk finally.
Yeah, now you part of the reason for this interview is people keep telling me you should talk to somebody from the other side, and this has always sort of confused me because I'm not really on a side. Both sides yell at me, but I think they mean someone who kind of comes at it from the, men's issues side, from sort of the other, somebody who's been accused of being hateful, violent, and misogynistic, to quote your Wikipedia entry. Now, I too have been accused of those things. However, let's talk about your gaming stuff first. I don't want to jump into that right away. I want people to get a better sense of who you are, because you got some pretty decent design credits. I mean, if Wikipedia is accurate, Monster Manual 5, that's pretty awesome. So what got you into designing for tabletop gaming?
Well, when I was young, I started out with like fighting fantasy books and things like that. But what we would do is, I would read the book to my friend, and he would make the choices. So even before we knew what tabletop gaming was, we were kind of doing it in a way, with me playing the games master and him being the player. And then through fighting fantasy, I got introduced to more proper role playing, I guess. So I've been doing that since I was 8 or 9, and it was just, I was always the games master, always making stuff up, and so it seemed like a natural progression, really. That's what I wanted to do. So that's how I got into it. And then when the pressure was on to get a proper job, I started looking around for any way to escape that fate, and eventually managed to get some work for Steve Jackson Games, writing the Munchkin's Guide to Power Gaming, which launched the whole Munchkin franchise. And then, unfortunately, I still had to get a proper job, but then I was freelancing in the meantime. And then I lost my job in the .com bubble burst. And there was literally nothing around, so I started designing and self-publishing full-time, and that's where I've been ever since.
Now, tabletop gaming is hardly a wretched hive of scum and misogyny. It tends to be a pretty progressive place. How do you really self-define your politics?
I guess that depends who you ask. Some people think it is a wretched hive. My politics... I'm undergoing a bit of a shift at the moment, but I would still primarily define myself as a left anarchist, really. I believe in community, I believe in equality, I believe in working together, and I believe in sort of mutual volunteerism. So working together to get things done, not necessarily with state interference, but pragmatically, I'm a socialist, I guess.
So your alignment is chaotic good.
Yeah.
Okay. That's something people understand. All right, we get it now. It's been amazing to me, at least on this channel, how much sort of Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop gaming references become this almost a Rosetta Stone for concepts. I personally believe that awareness of tabletop gaming is more far-reaching than people would like to admit. What do you feel about sort of the common awareness of tabletop gaming working in the industry?
It's hard to gauge. I mean, I guess in the 80s and early 90s, at the height of the satanic panic and everything, everyone knew vaguely what it was. I guess they knew of it. Now, even though we're having a similar kind of moral panic around games, including tabletop games, there's a much more positive image of tabletop gaming, and people know it through things like Will Wheaton's YouTube show, and it appears on Stranger Things, which I think was probably an ET reference when it was put in there. So it shows up all over the place. People know it. People know it via computer games. People would play D&D games on a computer that would never sit down and play D&D around a tabletop with their friends. So it's just kind of part of the warp and weft of nerd culture, I guess. Everyone understands at least some of the references, so it's a good common language.
See, the thing about tabletop gaming for me is you can't be an asshole and stay with a gaming group. There is a certain vulnerability to me about tabletop games that video games just don't have, because you're sitting there looking at two other people being silly, essentially, for fun.
Yeah, for long-term groups, I think that's the thing. I mean, at conventions, you'll often run into us.
Oh, yeah. I don't play grand tournaments anymore. I did a few, and one round of third ed took 45 minutes. That's the problem with third edition Dungeons & Dragons. Yeah.
And gamers can be a really tolerant bunch, possibly even too tolerant. I mean, it's a beautiful thing, but they'll put up with assholes and people who don't wash, and they'll happily sit and play with them at least for a while until it gets to be too much, without really saying anything.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with tabletop gaming is even if you smell okay going in after 6 hours of sitting there and you've got sort of, adrenaline sweat, nobody smells especially good after that. And I mean, that teenage boy funk, which when I was playing D&D, I didn't know what that smell was. I just knew it was D&D smell, but it's sort of that teenage boy aroma is, it happens to gamers and non-gamers alike, I think. Yeah. But I
gamer pheromones.
Yeah,
this is where I belong.
Yeah, exactly. But it's funny to me because my experiences with the material and my experiences meeting the creators are so out of step with the stereotypes about tabletop gaming. It's like you said, some people would say it's a, wretched hive of scum and misogyny. And I'm sitting here going, no, I've always found it super cool. I mean, you talk to people like, a guy like Ed Greenwood, a guy like Steve Jackson or anything like that. They don't have any hate in their hearts for anybody except people with hate in their hearts. I mean, this is a pretty... You guys are creatives, right? And with that comes an element of inclusivity and acceptance of other people's ideas. So do you think it's just because it's a predominantly male hobby, or is there something else leading to the stereotype?
It's partly that. But I think there's something... The cultural zeitgeist has shifted. Okay. So if you look at what, when D&D and so on started, it was kind of the tail end of the hippie movement. It very much started in universities. That was where it really took off and took root, was in universities, which were, pretty progressive places, even back then. But it's a different kind of progressivism. It was the kind of free love, more libertine, sort of free speech, the Oz trial, all that kind of stuff was going on through the 60s and 70s. And you look at the media back then, it was much more... It's paradoxical because there are things that kind of push the boat out now, but there was definitely an impetus to be more free and open, more freely expressive that was going on back then. So that kind of attitude, or the free speech attitude, the anything goes attitude, has stayed a bit, particularly with older gamers. But the newer wave of progressive gamers have a different mindset, that some of these things are bad or dangerous or wrong, and so that's where you get the culture clash. It's still predominantly a very, very progressive community, but there's different kinds of progress that are fighting with each other, I think.
Now, I mean, video games, I guess I can sort of understand, because once the game is out, the cake is baked, you have a limited number of choices. But with tabletop, I mean, what core rules is a joke? Nobody who's an experienced tabletop gamer plays core rules. We all adapt them, and that's true of storylines as well. If you don't like, a particular faction or culture, don't use them, So these systems are not... They don't seem to me structurally things that we should worry about, because it's all about making any game you want, isn't it?
Yeah, it's always about homebrew with tabletop gaming. Yeah. And once you produce a book and you put it out there, it's out of your hands. People can do whatever they want with it. But people still seem to want to put pressure on designers to change that core book, to make it inclusive, to compromise their own vision, whatever that might be, to accommodate the wishes of other people, even though, you know, they could just spend 5 minutes or leave something out or put something in themselves to make it exactly what they want. And that's the beauty of it, as far as I'm concerned, that you can make it whatever you want and do whatever you want with it. That's what, to me, still makes tabletop gaming superior to computer gaming in a lot of ways, is that creative, anything goes within reason attitude, that you can literally describe anything you want to do and do it. If you want to change the world, you can change it, all of that. But it seems to be they want you to set the kind of ground mode of the game, the canon of the game, to support whatever it is that they happen to want. I mean, it's all kinds of different groups wanting different things. So whereas I would probably respect the original artist's vision a bit more, at least in terms of letting them write what they want, and then, you know, I'll tear it to shreds myself later and turn it into what I want.
Well, I think people do that. I mean, interpretation happens when you're executing something. You're going to put your own spin on it, and I mean, anybody who's run a good tabletop session, your players surprise you. You end up throwing stuff in at the last minute because they didn't do what you expected them to do. You had like options A through D, and they threw you a complete curveball. I remember one where I threw in magical goats because I just didn't know what else to do. I needed to move them along, and they weren't taking the bait. But it's an inherently, I mean, especially when you get into systems like, you know, the Ravenloft campaign setting, where you can literally like reset the fundamentals of a campaign just by going to the fortune teller. There's an element, like I said, I mean, this is connecting to the vulnerability I'm talking about. There's an element of chaos in it that just seems to be inherent. So, you know, based on your experiences as somebody who's gotten yelled at for not, you know, tabletopping right, is it, like, what's caused? Is it validation? Is it a need for control? Is it a lack of imagination? Like, I'm just throwing examples out here because I really don't understand this.
I don't particularly understand it either, despite having been shouted at a lot about it. I think some of it's inclusion. Now, I kind of understand that more when it comes to TV series and so on, because that's passive entertainment. Mm-hmm. But in a role-playing game, you're making up your own character, so long as your games master's okay with it, be whatever you want. Mm-hmm. But they seem to want to see it in the text, in the art, to have their decisions and desires validated in that way by the designer. So that's where it seems to come from. There's also, I mean, tabletop gamers are quite evangelical about their hobby. They really want other people to play, and lots of people think that, you know, if you throw a smattering of illustrations of people of color as heroes throughout your book, that will somehow magically cause a whole bunch of, you know, minority gamers to appear out of the ether and start playing. I appreciate the concern. I understand the motivation behind it, and I think it's a good motivation, but I don't think that's going to make that much difference. I think you'd have to attack the problem in other ways if you wanted to bring people in, and I think it's a niche hobby with narrow appeal anyway.
Well, people would have to know it's there in order to take issue with it. I mean, I started playing tabletop gaming in a very multicultural community. I mean, it was one guy was from Czechoslovakia, and I don't even remember where the other guy was from. Probably was Korea, but, you know, I don't associate gaming with white people just because of where I grew up, and I realized that's skewed. But for us, it was because it was cheap. You know, back then you could photocopy the books without the copy shop saying, no, this violates copyright. And, you know, you only needed one set of books, and 4 people could play, and you could make up all the stories you want. And this was back in second ed days. So they didn't have, I mean, it was the wizard, I think they called it. And I was like, I want to be a female wizard. And, you know, the guy running it was like, okay, you can be the sorceress. And it was the exact same thing. You just changed the name. But it really was, I mean, I think the packaging of it pre Lord of the Rings may have made some people feel like it wasn't for them, but you know, there have been other things that people have connected to, and I don't find young people, and I find most people start, like you said, in college, or I started in like grade 6, but a lot of people started later. But I remember getting into it because I like the dice. It had nothing to do with inclusion or women, or it was like, what are those? I want them, you know.
Yeah.
And they're like, it's a game. I'm like, tell me more. And I was already sort of into video games and things like that, but this was like, you know, it was the freedom, like you said, the ability to make up your own stories. So how do you think more people can engage with tabletop gaming? Is it that evangelical system of people just talking about it and, hey, come in and play with us?
I think that's a good thing. I think the sort of gaming culture has always been open. I don't understand where this idea that it isn't or hasn't been comes from. I mean, I guess it can be intimidating to enter a room that's 90% men and 90% white, I suppose, but they'll be welcoming. Mm-hmm. You know, they might be socially awkward, but they'll be lovely people by and large. So what I find tends to put people off is that it's books and mathematics, you know, and you have to read and do things like that. And certain subcultures have a anti-intellectual bias to them, you know, sort of anti-nerd bias. That's eroded a bit now. I don't think people today quite appreciate how much of an outcast it used to make you to be into geeky things, which is great in one way but bad in another because they don't understand what it's like. But I think that's what you'd need to overcome, that hostility to reading. I mean, I've had great experiences prior in my life running games for people who were terrible at English and terrible at maths, but because they were engaged with the game, they struggled through, and you know, their English skills improved, their maths skills improved, they did better at school, all through gaming, because it made those skills relevant and interesting to them. So that's how you do it, outreach, I suppose, and just get people interested that way in the fun of it.
Yeah, that's a very good point, that the base skills required to play most tabletop systems. I mean, White Wolf might be a good one to start because it's quite simple. It's just 6-sided dice and, you know, you're off to the races. The character creation's a bit complex, but it requires relatively few numbers, which I think was the point of it. But let's move on to sort of this social stuff and ease in so people don't have an aneurysm, because this is something that I am concerned about, again, because my experiences with gamers, both tabletop and video game, and at this point I think it's fair to say I have had quite a lot of exposure to other gamers of very many different types in different countries around the world. And my experience has just not been the stereotype. So let's start there. Do you think there's a different disconnect in that regard? Not the engagement thing, but this whole bad PR issue that has led, I think, to a charge before anybody even opens their mouth.
See, again, I look back at the 80s and 90s when we were all evil devil worshippers, and that was cool. You know, kids were interested and wanted to come and play because it was forbidden fruit, and you know, because they were into heavy metal that was also being told off. Now it's just kind of, it's either okay or it's Big Bang Theory, laugh at the nerds sort of thing going on, which is off-putting to people. So I think that's worse for us than the kind of accusations of horribleness is the, oh, that's just nerdy rubbish, why would anyone want to do it, sort of the uncoolness. But you know, that's worn off a bit too. It's just another hobby, I think, now, or at least it's becoming just another hobby, which is good in some ways, but I have a bit of nostalgia for being a bad boy.
I kind of do as well. I mean, the fact that it was something different, you know, something I think that I found made it cool. in its own way.
Yeah.
And it was numbers and it was letters. It was like school without school. So let's get into your personal story and how you ended up with a Wikipedia entry that says hateful, violent, and misogynistic. And it began with an article, I understand, yes?
There's some stuff before then,
Okay.
but nothing really took off until I wrote an article.
So is this a blog? Is this published articles? What are we talking about here?
Just a personal blog.
Okay.
So I wrote an article called clickbaity, in defense of rape.
Okay.
Don't worry, that's not what it actually was.
Well, I read it before.
Yeah.
For people who I guess we'll have to link to it so people can get a sense of it. But my take on it was it was about the narrative device, not the actual real life phenomenon.
That's right.
Okay.
So what basically it was triggered by the whole Lara Croft reboot, if you remember the controversy over the scene where she gets trapped and the thug's reaching for her, and it's very much implied that she's about to undergo a sexual assault or something. And everyone was up in arms, and before they even knew it was Rhianna Pratchett that was writing it, even, lots of people were flying off the handle about this, saying, how can you? It disempowers the hero. Whereas I saw it as an expression of threat, of peril. You place a character that you care about in a position of something nasty happening to them, so you get invested in the character. You want to escape as the character, and you want to reassert that character's strength by getting out of that situation. So to me, that's a good narrative hook. But they were basically saying at this point that nobody should ever write about rape or sexual assault. No one should ever include it in any fiction, and that seemed bad to me on a number of different levels.
Well, it's very final.
Yeah, it's an absolute. And I don't agree. I mean, just purely as a free speech advocate and a free expression advocate, I believe you should be allowed to write about anything, really. And it's down to the reader or the viewer to look away or close the book or not buy the thing in the first place if they don't like what's in it. And that should be an end to it. Just because you don't like something doesn't mean other people can't like it. So I just basically wrote this peeved, spirited defense of the right to express yourself in any way, and I expanded on that a bit by saying, look, these are the reasons this kind of thing is appealing to people who create stories. And okay, maybe it's lazy, maybe it's hackneyed, but I don't think you can ban people from using a plot element just because they're amateurish or bad at it. I mean, that's too subjective. How do you decide who's done it well and who hasn't? People are going to have different opinions.
Right. Now, if people are wondering why I'm not challenging any of this, it's because the purpose of this is not to get into these opinions. The purpose of this is to set up what came next.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
and the plan was to do a series of these articles originally. I think I did write the second one.
You did one on murder as well.
Yeah, in defense of murder. I was going to talk about torture and all these other things and why these are appealing. But there was just so much backlash to that original post. I don't think most people read past the title because I was being accused of being a rape apologist and all kinds of horrible stuff was happening. A couple of petitions went up to try and campaign for companies never to employ me again. And
over a blog post? Yeah. Okay.
It was just... I mean, I'd had some hints that something like this was going on, but the strength of this and the suddenness of it just really kind of blindsided me. It's like, what? This isn't what I'm saying. No one seemed to care what I was actually saying. I could explain until I was blue in the face that what I was talking about was free expression and art and the ability to tell stories and how, some people find these kind of stories cathartic even, all that kind of thing. But no, I was just literally excusing rape and I was a terrible person and no one should ever employ me and you should boycott all my products. And it was ludicrous.
That doesn't lead to I'm doing running commentary here. So this was basically it. It wasn't like you were on particular websites. It wasn't that you were advocating anything in the real world. It was just this one blog post about Tomb Raider, and I believe there's a reference to Game of Thrones at the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was it.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I'd done some products that a few people didn't like, but there wasn't this kind of same groundswell of hatred and backlash that came about from that.
Yeah, I had a similar thing. It seems whenever you use the word rape, you're in for it. And I think you can't really understand how much you're in for it until you step in it, at least from my my experience. The minute you go down that road, people don't pay attention to what you're saying. They just want to kill it dead.
Yeah.
And, you know, I got into it with the reality that a major theme of the game The Witcher 2 is rape. Both literal and figurative. It is.
Love that game.
Yeah, but it is tough. It is tough to, and I mean, this is a question of who is this game for? And I find it quite interesting that you say that rape as a plot device can be cathartic for the audience, because I think a lot of women would go, well, it's not that at all, because the whole idea of rape is you can't get out of it. There's no escape. You can't fight them off. And this is the reality that is not addressed by these plot lines. And I mean, even Tomb Raider, the plot was set by the male designers. You know, Rhianna Pratchett came in later. But, you know, I'm not saying this to say you're wrong. I'm saying this to say there is a different perspective to this.
Yeah, but that's not me speaking, really. It's what people who were supporting me, women who were supporting me, were telling me that this can be cathartic. And
okay, so this is women you've spoken to who have said this can be cathartic. Yeah, I mean, this is because I see your point. I also see because my escapism does not involve this kind of stuff. And I think that it's done too thoughtlessly. Now, that being said, I think part of the reason it's done like a hammer is because we can't have the discussions like we're having right now. It's just nowadays people either avoid it completely because they're afraid, or they do it to be an asshole. Like they do it to make a point. I feel more and more. And I mean, then you get the Walking Dead phenomenon where they cave a guy's head in with an improbable eyeball left over because it's a comic book homage, but, 2% of their audience recognize it as a comic book homage. So it just traumatized everybody else. And it's because, there seems to be this thing in art right now. Like you said, there's been a shift. As you say in the article, the idea of sexual assault as a plot line is not a new thing.
No.
It seems, however, that as one person put it after the most recent Walking Dead episode, I think it was Variety, that said it's less about engaging your audience now and more about messing with them, about shocking them, about leading them in the wrong direction and then destroying their dreams. Do you see this happening as well? And do you see a connection?
I mean, just to go back a little bit, right, I agree that when people employ these elements, it's often done very, very poorly in ways that I don't like, that make me cringe or, fast forward or whatever it is, because I don't want to watch it or I think it's really poorly done. But I think people need to have the space to screw up. And
American McGee's Alice the Madness Returns is a game about two women, one of whom isn't around anymore, who were groomed by a pedophile.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what the game's about. And that game wouldn't exist if we could ban, Rapey McEvilson as a villain. So, I mean, that game, which is applauded by a lot of feminists, kind of makes your case for you.
Yeah.
And
I don't think we can stand in judgment whether someone's done it well or not. I mean, there's always going to be cases you can point at, and you'll have near universal agreement that was done poorly. There will always be cases that you can look at and people will be in near universal agreement it's been done well. But there's a whole space in the middle, and people need to have room to screw up. Now, the manipulate your audience thing, I like that they went that far in Walking Dead. I like that they stuck to that kind of gut punch from the comics, and that people got so upset about it speaks to me of the effectiveness that can have. They kind of lulled everyone into a full sense of security, which happens in the comic as well, with Alexandria and everyone feeling kind of settled and safe, and Rick's back in his right. I'm in charge. I'm capable. I'm handling everything, and then they just pull that away from you. And it was so effective because you'd been suckered in and because you'd grown to care about these characters. And it reestablished that nobody is safe in this series, just as nobody's safe in Game of Thrones. If you love a character, you've got to actually be worried for them because it doesn't obey the normal narrative rules of those stories.
Except I think that A Song of Ice and Fire set those narrative rules. I would say that because it's smart epic fantasy, according to the powers that be, every time I see this sort of nihilistic, it's either somebody doing George R.R. Martin or somebody doing Steve Niles in some way. I mean, The Walking Dead is Robert Kirkman doing Steve Niles, and I know this is really inside baseball for people who don't know these names, but I'm nerding out at the moment. I'm of that camp because I've been around long enough. I find these stories boring and predictable, and I have to be reminded every so often that that's me. This is new and fresh and a thing for other people. I mean, I sort of thought it was, they did issue 100. That's cool. I mean, after wandering badly, I maintain away from the pacing of the book. I think they should get back on it a little bit more. Personally, I mean,
that's actually a huge problem for me in working in games, in fantasy games in particular. I've read it all. I've seen it all before. I get so bored when I get asked to write another dwarves and elves thing. I just, no, I want to do something different. But the audience doesn't necessarily want something different.
And yet every so often somebody comes around and does something fresh. I mean, I'm thinking Dragon Age Origins. I'm thinking, to jump genres, Westworld. It's the same components, but they're using it in a different way, or to, this is such a cliche, but to say something different. Yeah. And I think there's an element of everything old is new again to an extent as well.
Yeah, nothing's new. Everything's been done before in one way or another, but then they turn up in new combinations. Right. So to people who aren't necessarily as deep into it all as maybe you and I are, then something like Game of Thrones or Walking Dead doing that is new and shocking and terrifying.
There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong. I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm shitting on these things. It's just people are like, how can you not watch these shows? Or they try to engage me with it. It's like, I read the books. That's all I need. I feel very disconnected from this stuff because I don't need pop culture entertainment to validate my nerd. And I feel like there's a lot of, how can you not watch this? You have to, it's like supporting a political party. You have to watch everything, and it's like, no, this is entertainment. It should entertain me. But that doesn't mean I don't think it's great. I mean, I've got one friend who is just obsessed with The Walking Dead and was in there like defending every moment of that episode on Facebook. And I'm like, you know what? Good for you. And this gets back around to this thing of, I think there's a disconnect, and I'm curious about what you think about this. Creators are like, any emotional response in the audience is a good one. Whether they're cheering, whether they're booing, as long as they're watching, as long as they continue to engage, you've done your job. Whereas the audience seems to be, no, you need to personally validate me every episode.
There's definitely a clash between these different things pulling at you, and especially with so many series being so precarious now, where you don't know whether you're going to get your second or third season. It can be hard to lay the groundwork for those really satisfying arcs in the way, say, J. Michael Straczynski did with Babylon 5, which was planned out as a huge arc right from the start.
Except that fifth season, and oh boy, does it show.
Yes.
Yeah.
because you want people to watch, but you also want to be able to create something larger and more special, I guess. I mean, some of that's somewhat snobby, I suppose, and everyone wants to create art and be remembered for something, and you do have this demand, this need to satisfy your audience. But then you look at something like Firefly, which was cancelled, and yet people still worship the ground it flies over, I guess.
Yeah, that was an interesting one, because Firefly was a great idea that didn't really gel in the time it had completely. It had a lot of very new elements that, like anything, it sometimes takes the time to get them working the way they are. You see that with a lot of new shows. The first episode is dreadful. The second is better. By the third one, it's starting to find its feet. Now, with a game, unless you're doing like one of these episodic downloadable $10 a chapter kind of thing, you don't have that luxury of farting around for 2 games, although that's not always true. You could say that about a lot of Ubisoft franchises. The first one, whether it's Assassin's Creed or Watch Dogs, is an interesting idea, but the execution is not quite there. By the second one, boom, right? All of a sudden they understand it.
Yeah, and in tabletop games, it's even harder, because there is no set storyline. You're not really creating a story. You're creating a playground in which people tell their own stories. So.
Yeah, you're creating a framework.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like here's an idea to get you started. Now go off and do your own thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or I mean, I'd come back to books if I didn't feel like taking, the 4 days to prep a campaign a week. It's like, oh, I'm gonna, grab a book and run through it just because I'm short on time this week. And some of those were amazing. Like I would use the books to learn about certain factions or certain races or something like that I didn't feel like I had a grip on.
Yeah. The old gazetteers were good for that. The old TSR Gazette publications.
Yeah. Oh God, yeah, that's going back a ways. But yeah, it was like that. You get this sort of, oh, now I get it. Now I know how to play an orc. Before that, orcs are sort of the thing of, oh, there's an orc, kill it. Okay, that was the orc. You don't really get them as characters, and they're like, now I kind of feel they're this interesting kind of foreign, creepy, not, other. And that's interesting. But that gets back into that, oh, other bad, but...
Well, the orcs have been kind of civilized and redeemed in game settings. It's kind of weird. I guess it reflects the maturity of the hobby. But in some ways, I miss the monsters.
I do too. It seems we seem to be living in a post-monster society where we have to understand and try to empathize with everything, and so we end up with these works of fiction that revolve around the villains, or these really, I don't know, I find them cheap anti-heroes. Because which do you find harder to write as a creator? I know the answer for me, but I'm curious about you. Villains or heroes?
See, I think there's only a very slight difference between the two in a way. A villain is trying to do what they think is the right thing, at least for them, but by more extreme methods, perhaps. While a hero is trying to do the right thing, maybe by them, maybe by everybody, but they're kind of hampered by a code or concern for others, some kind of connection. So to me, I guess there's not that much difference, but because they're hampered, I think heroes are probably harder for me to write.
I find that too. I can crack out a good villain like nobody's business, but getting a hero, because we love villains because they don't have to be likable.
Yeah.
And getting back into this culture war thing, it's almost like evil has to be so despicable there's no nuance to it anymore. And I mean, to me, Loki in the Avengers movies is the shining example of this. In the first Thor film, he was contained. you could almost predict what he was going to do. He was so much that Shakespearean second son, you know? And then we jump to the Avengers, and he's whatever kind of evil the scene requires. And to me, I'm just like, oh, you just snipped the strings on this character. You've broken all the tension in this villain. One evil is just as good as another. And then I look at the creative person behind it, and it's like, well, of course it is, you know, because for someone with a hammer, everything's a nail, right?
I always like Doctor Doom because he doesn't see himself as a villain. Really.
I think there's I don't think Magneto sees himself as a villain either.
No, definitely. He's another great example.
Yeah. But I mean, that was the amazing thing about those Marvel characters from that era, is they really started, they were taking the push-pull of, you know, the last majorly tumultuous time in Western society. You know, the 60s and 70s, I'm sure, were not the funnest times for some people, because it was always, you know, protests and riots and a lot of drugs, and people were screaming out the downfall of society back then as well, and, you know, all the conspiracy theories about the CIA and LSD and all that stuff. And there's a lot of similarities to today, but there's almost a defeatism now that I don't remember. But the little bits I remember of like the 1970s and early 80s, that defeatism that we have now wasn't there before. And
people don't, well, maybe people don't feel that they can change anything really significant, which is why they fight so hard to change little petty things.
That's what I think as well. And I don't know what I don't know how to break through that, because that's a really deep hole, right? I mean, that's practically, they've cast a level drain spell on everyone in the entire game. Like, all your stats are just shot. Like, how do you fight anything?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, I mean, through this experiences of writing an article, and I'm sure if your experience was anything like mine, you kind of like, this is going to ruffle some feathers, and there's probably some stuff in here that is kind of inadvisable, but if I were to read something like this, I'd understand it for what it was. So you expected like this much blowback. Yeah. And then you got this much blowback.
Yeah, and I didn't handle it well.
What do you mean by that? Because that's a very sort of, you know, introspective comment.
I got very angry, very defensive. I lashed out at people, basically called them idiots for not reading what I'd written. I got very patronizing and condescending towards people for not reading what I'd written.
Okay, why do you think you handled it badly for getting offended by someone calling you a misogynist? I mean, that is a heavy thing to level at someone.
Well, yeah, that's why I don't see myself that way.
Right.
So, you know, they were going after my core self-identity. Basically, you know, just because, you know, I like pin-up art, or, you know, I write erotica, or I like writing about kinky stuff or whatever, doesn't mean I hate women, or, you know, I think there's to me at least, there's a rather sharp divide between reality and fantasy that other people don't seem to understand the same way. There was actually a psychological study in the 1980s of gamers during the time there was this whole fuss going on, that said that gamers do have this heightened ability to tell reality from fantasy, and that basically meant that when they took things like personality tests for psychosis and so on, it screwed the whole system up, because they could tell that it wasn't real, and they were treating it like a fantasy scenario and not as something real. So maybe the problem is mine, that I just can't get into that same headspace as them and see the two as relating that closely or influencing each other. You know, I see the two as very distinct and separate to me. So I think you can write about something problematic. You can write a nasty villain or whatever, and it doesn't really reflect on you. Maybe
because
you're writing
a villain.
Yeah, so maybe you're writing something nasty to make a point that that thing is nasty, and to show that the villain is horrible and
Right.
someone you should be against. Maybe you want to explore dark themes. It doesn't mean you approve of them. It's just I don't know. I don't get it. I just short circuit when I try to get my head around that.
It's interesting though that you there's an element of self-blame for what happened though, and it sounds to me like, I mean, you had the exact same response I did. Well, my first thing was, seriously? I mean, that's my first reaction whenever I feel like something got misconstrued. Like, and not even misconstrued. Sometimes I feel like it's deliberately warped. Like people are invested in finding the worst possible message, worst possible influence, just assuming some conspiracy when it was just somebody popping off and drunk blogging.
Well, since then, I've been monstered. So people have gone back through everything I've ever written, looking for the absolute worst possible interpretation of everything that I've ever done, and everything new that I put out. Similarly gets gone through with a fine-tooth comb.
Really?
Some people, and people pirate anything I put out and announce that they've pirated it so that people will grab it for free and not pay me. And this is going on years later. There are people just dedicated to trying to make my life miserable.
Wait, hang on. These people who claim to be paragons of morality are essentially committing theft.
How many of them are, that's the motivation? How many are simply trolls that know I'm a good locus for drama? It's hard to tell.
Okay, so you're an easy target now.
The drama around me,
right,
is often. I'm not a particularly good target for trolls. I don't think, because I tend to ignore them and move on. But the storms that go on around me seem to attract people who like causing trouble.
Now, have you found there are these easy insults? I mean, maybe misogynist is the one for you. I notice that these people who are just intent on making me into this stock villain from central casting, they fling these accusations with no real evidence. They're hilariously off base, but they stick because it's just the right thing to call someone who is the stock villain from central casting. And there seems to be this script of, I got it all. I'm a professional victim. I'm too sensitive. I have a thin skin. If any of these things were true, I would have deleted my Twitter account right now. I would have been, doing a whole bunch of things I have not done. Have you, because I don't know what it's like to be a guy going through this, is there a similar sort of litany of when did you stop beating your wife type things that are very difficult to disprove?
I mean, it's interesting you point out how it differs, because I think you've definitely suffered abuse, but it takes on a slightly different character. To the kind of thing that I get. I mean, they very much focused on going after me professionally. They didn't want me to work again. Was the main thing, and they still try to censor stuff that I put out.
Oh, they went after me professionally as well.
Okay.
But I mean, and the logs to prove it, but they're the same. See, I'm getting it from both sides. So it's a factional thing. It's not a gender thing. The various sort of regressive factions have their checklist of things they just bombard people with.
Yeah. I mean, the sexism accusation is, I think, more effective against a guy. This whole idea that you're misogynistic, that you're a rape apologist, and all this, I think it has more bite when it's directed at a man. At least that's how I feel, to be on the receiving.
Well, I'd understand why you'd feel that way, because it affects you personally. I mean, you can only know what it feels like to be you.
Yeah.
And
I don't tend to like relying on feelings in an argument, but this is a feelings-oriented thing, so
and they're real. I mean, I think people forget that people who produce games, and I'm not going to say art, because games are art plus other things, that's a very personal thing for you. And for someone to just dump on it because of a political, I don't think people who haven't created something can really understand what that does to a person. And I personally would like to get past this idea that a creator having a bad reaction to that is something wrong, or something you shouldn't do, because I think that takes the humanity out of it. You
Yeah,
know?
definitely. I think you should be allowed to bite back. I mean, I try not to let it get to me.
Oh, but it does. It always does.
But it does.
Yeah.
But excuse me. The big thing that bothers me is not being able to communicate to people what I actually mean. So, like with the article, going back to that, I was trying to say censorship is bad. People should have creative freedom to do whatever they want. But people were reading, this guy thinks rape is okay, and attacking me on that basis. So what I was trying to get across to people completely failed to get across to some of them, whether willfully or otherwise. That's the part that upsets me, because I quite often put subtexts and ideas into my work that I want people to kind of discover, but it seems to be too subtle, and people read the top message and get offended by it or whatever, and then come at me for things that I'm not actually expressing. That's what tends to upset me. I've had to be stoic and distance myself and intellectualize as a survival tactic, because I have quite severe depression.
Gee, I wonder why. People trying to ruin your career and shitting all over work you've worked hard on. Gee, yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, I have it anyway. It's clinical. It's something that's always there. But when
which
stuff
is
like
very
that
common
happens,
with creatives.
Yeah. But when stuff like that happens, it does get to you. But my coping mechanism is to ignore it and intellectualize it and step away from it and not engage with it on an emotional level as much as possible. But you can't do that all the time.
Yeah. I think that's something that needs to come back into this dialogue of this whole, trying to excise, trying to surgically remove feelings from these. It's not possible. We're feeling people, especially since a lot of this stuff comes smack out of the medievalist romantic tradition. It's all about these big emotional experiences, right? Like that defines this sword and sorcery type genre.
Yeah, it requires an investment of emotion and self into what you're creating, whether it's art, whether it's writing, whether it's games. For it to have any kind of emotional resonance or authenticity, you have to put something genuine into it. Otherwise, you're just painting by numbers and it's meaningless, essentially. So that when people do come after it, they are not just attacking the work. Often they're attacking you. Criticisms are tough, but in the end they're good. But there seems to be this conflation in people's minds of criticism and something else, like censorship or hatred, or that they can't simply say, I don't like this. It becomes, I don't like this, therefore it should not exist.
There's a lot of perfect is the enemy of the good going on in the industry right now. Like nothing's perfect. You can take the greatest work of art out there and, something's wrong with it.
Yeah.
Something's wrong with Shakespeare. Something's wrong with Milton. Something's wrong with, at the time, people didn't even think Shakespeare wrote his plays because he wasn't educated enough to have done it. It's strange to me. And I think partially it's the education system, because I know when I was in university, I was like, man, they expect us to be completely brutal to these great works of art, right? I remember the one that really got to me was Frankenstein. Because I'm like, oh, Frankenstein's awesome. I took 2 courses just because that book was on the course list. And they tore it apart. Yeah. And I had this moment of, if these books are only judged on their flaws, or the flaws are the focus, then how can anything thrive in this environment? And that's where I feel like one with gaming is that if you write an article about how great something is, you may get 500 views. If you write an article about how something sucks, you'll get, 250,000 views because people want to yell at you.
I don't know if that's something you can overcome, because that's kind of baked into human psychology to treat threats and things like dangers, things that upset you, as being way higher on the important scale than nice things. So it's hard to see how to overcome that so long as things are driven by clicks. Basically, there's going to be that temptation. to do that.
There's clickbait though, but we're so aware of clickbait now that there's got to be more to it than that. You know, like we all know clickbait happens. We all know it's annoying. We all do it because it works. But the actual content, I mean, I keep looking back at what you wrote. And yes, it is very in your face. But I can think of some other very in-your-face articles that said things like, gamers are dead, gamers are over, gamers don't have to be your audience, they're misogynist neckbeards. And that was defended as opinion writing.
Yeah.
So, and this was the sort of the key question I had for you. Why are some controversial opinions acceptable? And when people have this backlash to it, they're like, what? Death of the author, you know, and others, they're handing out the pitchforks and torches, and it's the same people defending creative expression on one hand, and everybody seems to do that with my friendlies are allowed to do it, but if you're wearing a different color, if you're from a different house, you're not allowed. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think it's just, how do I put this without sounding hugely pretentious?
The problem is this whole topic is pretentious, right? It's shit that ultimately does not matter. And that's part of what is so frustrating.
Okay, I think it is emergently complex behavior. I think that social networks act like bird flocks, basically. I did a video on Gamergate about this, how it's basically an emergent system. So you need a certain critical mass of people moving with one point of view for something to really happen and have an impact. And I think that pseudo-progressive point of view doesn't necessarily have the numbers overall, but it has the numbers in media position,
in pockets,
key blogs, places like that. Force multipliers, they call it in the military, don't they? Yeah. So they've got access to these bullhorns, basically. So it amplifies their reach and the numbers of people and so on. And on the other hand, you've got the people who disagree with them tend to be more scattered, tend to be more individualistic. So it takes more of them moving in the same direction to make an impact. So it's much easier for that side to say these things and get away with it, and it's much harder for people on the other side to say things and get away with it. And that's a swap that's really only happened since the mid-90s, maybe a bit later, that you start to see that cultural shift the other way. I think people were much more libertine before, perhaps. You know, you look back, I mean, I can't help but keep making these comparisons, but you look at what's happening today, and the problem with the controversies in tabletop gaming and in video gaming, in that this time it's coming from inside our own house, whereas before the criticisms and the attacks always came from outside. Jack Thompson, Pat Pulling with the bothered about Dungeons and Dragons, or you can go all the way back to Frederick Wortham and horror comics. All these attacks came from outside, and people came together to fight them. Now our worst critics, though I wouldn't necessarily actually call them critics, but our enemies, the people who are besieging us, are people inside, and we don't have a way to cope with that yet.
So it's like that tabletop gaming scenario where you're in like this house or tower and a bunch of kobolds come out of a trapdoor on the floor, and one by one they're not so bad, but when 20 come out, your party's kind of fucked.
Yeah.
You don't have a fireball.
Or that one game where you have the guy playing the thief in your group who is a dick and keeps stealing from the other players.
oh, it's more like that.
Yeah.
Okay. So
that's more the way I see it.
That's interesting. It's funny because I keep looking at this article and you flat out say what you're saying. I mean, the line, and I know this is not the line that was quoted, but you say something about, where is it? Something about a free speech argument does not advocate assault.
Yeah.
And that seemed to be the point you were making.
Yeah.
And I wanted to read this before I talked to you because I wanted to read it, from a neutral position. And if I try, I can twist it into what people did with it. But you either have to have a bent going in and you're looking for it. And I mean, this comes down to people not being prepared to get pushback on their ideologies. I think where it may have come from is, you know, rape culture at face value, these terms, which are they're things like rape culture, things like the Bechdel test. These are populist manspreading, mansplaining. These aren't technical terms. These are populist things designed to describe a collection of phenomena. And they take on this power over and above the same way sort of Pepe did with the memes. I mean, whoever thought the mainstream media would completely have, you know, their missiles in a twist with over a cartoon frog.
Yeah, that whole thing. I was just, you know, watching video after video, reading article after article, just with my mouth open, going, "What? What is this even real?"
Well, and it. I mean, there's a lot of fear, and this is the other thing that short circuits this entire conversation. More and more, I'm becoming convinced, and I'm curious from your side. At the core of this is a dialogue being attempted by a lot of very frightened people. People aren't coming at it from a position of confidence. It goes back to that thing you were saying about it was kind of cool. When we were Satanists, that was kind of cool. But now that we're just nerds, it's Big Bang Theory, everybody laugh at the nerds. Yeah. You know? And I mean, what I've been told is that the people criticizing games, people see them as outsiders. They don't see them as actual. They are people within the games industry that do not identify as gamers. Yeah. And so it's this extra layer. It's not totally within the core group, but it's not totally outside the walls as well. It's this, you know, the Lannisters and the Starks kind of thing. How, from your perspective as someone who, you know, comes at it from you know, sort of a skeptical, you describe yourself as a skeptic.
Yeah.
How do we overcome this fear? Because I know the answer from my side is to just see the dork side for what it is and get this very powerful first-person trauma narrative into its proper place and start looking at this thing like rationalists instead of this ongoing stream of catharsis. But from the other side that doesn't have, you know, Dworkin, what do we do about it there?
The frustrating thing about being a rationalist in this is if you look at the kind of the statistics and things, you know, we live in one of the safest times in history. You know, street violence is down, sexual assault has been going down since the 90s. It's had a recent uptick, but that's probably due to more reporting and better reporting methods.
Well, every time they change the laws, there's an uptick because more things I mean, there was a burst in the 90s because they changed the laws.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, a lot more things were sexual assault.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you know, you can look at that, but the thing is, those kind of arguments make absolutely no impact on the people who are scared.
No, because it's fear. People don't make rational decisions when they're afraid.
You know, you can explain to your blue in the face that, okay, you're scared. I understand and respect that, but you don't have a good reason to be scared. There's no evidence that games will ever actually harmful, do any of these things that you're talking about. You know, even though you understand that they're scared, they take that as being...
Well, they take that as an insult instead of an attempt to empathize. And then they say, but they might, studies. And how many studies do we have to do before we recognize gaming as in television? It doesn't have the same cultivated effect.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, how many studies do we need debunking homeopathy? You know, that seems like there's one every 6 months and people still cling to that. So people have this emotional investment, and I don't know how to deal with it. Mm-hmm. If the different groups could just ignore each other and each go their own way and make their own thing, that would be cool. But unfortunately, this scared group wants to impose their point of view on everybody else. It's not sufficient for them to go off and make their own games and create their own parallel community, within the broader community. That's not enough for them. They have to go after other people for some reason. I guess I can understand it if I believed what they believe. If I believed that games genuinely did, make kids violent or made young boys treat women as objects or something, then if I believed that, I would fight as hard as they do to make that change. So I can understand, but I think they're wrong, and I think the statistics show that they're wrong. So I don't see a way to reconcile it. We might be able to just carry on and ignore them, but the risk if you do that is that they then get the ear of politicians and lawmakers and so on, because crazy people are motivated.
Yes.
Do a Google search on 9/11. You will find 10 to 100 times as many conspiracy pages as you will debunking pages, because crazy people are motivated. They've got so much energy to pour into these things, and their enthusiasm is contagious. So no, I don't have a solution. I don't even have a ghost of an idea of a solution. I fight and I argue, even though I know it's probably not going to have any effect on them.
You kind of get sucked into it still.
Yeah, and I kind of hope that the people who are just kind of watching, who aren't invested in either side necessarily, will be convinced by what I'm saying. You have the argument not to win over the person you're fighting with, but people who might be watching.
Well, let's take a step back then. Ideologically, how can we find common ground between a healthy dose of skepticism, which is very important? You need to prove your case, right? It's usually incumbent upon the accuser to present their case.
Yeah.
But combine that with this, well-meaning element that they want more people included. The ways they go about it, I do not agree with, but, inclusion is all about including these various factions who seem absolutely content to just, their entire purpose now is to rip each other apart, instead of going, this is your issue, where's the common ground on these issues? Because they don't have issues. They're just, you did this bad thing, well, you did this bad thing, well, Bell Hooks said this, well, Don Black said this, and it just, and so we go. It's the Hatfields and the McCoys. It's the, the Capulets and the Montagues. Where do we start to actually include this?
I think the point of agreement for most people is that basically we want the same thing, and what we disagree with is how to go about it.
And what is that?
Well, sticking to games, if we go back to the beginning of Gamergate, which we both know quite well, I think, well enough to discuss it in that context. What people wanted wasn't necessarily that different. Gamergate was perfectly happy to have more women in games, to have more diversity. Their argument was that this is already there to an extent, and that there are better ways to go about it than censorship and media manipulation and so on. A second thread to the whole thing, but it was definitely there.
The frustrating thing about that whole thing for me is that nobody could agree on what it was actually about, even within the pro-Gamergate faction. You asked for people, you got 5 opinions about what is Gamergate.
For me, it was about corruption in the games media primarily, and then the main second thread was this whole problem of censorship and control.
Well, and the two are connected. Like, there's a lot of overlap between those two concerns, absolutely.
So that's what defined the whole thing for me, at least. I obviously had a lot of personal buy-in on the censorship side
for obvious reasons, but I mean, there is a classic example of something that just went to absolute shit because no one could even agree what they were fighting about. There was no be it resolved, there was no central issue. It was this collective cathartic vomit that just seems to happen every 3 years or so in gaming, and the more it goes on, the less cohesive and coherent it becomes. And it almost seems like there's so many unresolved issues right now that because it was complicated, people decided to make it simple and go, well, these are a bunch of people who hate women, which I see where they got that based on the Archduke Franz Ferdinand moment of the whole thing, with it being a woman who was pilloried for what many people claim are private life indiscretions. But like World War I, it wasn't about that. And anybody who's savvy enough on the internet knows that wouldn't have created this 2-year, and it's still sort of petering out. We've sort of hit the half-life, but it's not.
The leaks and things that came out kind of pushed it back up a bit for a while. I think.
Yeah, and I mean that's uncomfortable for me because I was directly named in that, and
so was I.
Oh, were you? Because it's like it just seems so foolish to me. I'm a roll up my sleeves and get things done kind of person, and I don't. The thing that's so frustrating for me is I see very little conflict between people who want equality between the genders and people who are like, hang on, whoa, men have issues that need solving too. This seems, when you actually break it down, this seems like stuff where there can be, at least on issues like mental health, suicide prevention, things like that. These are all things that common ground would be very easily achieved if everybody just took a damn breath and had a conversation.
You would think, but there's people who are just too invested in their camp, their tribe, to do that. I mean, you kind of implied that I was a men's rights activist at the beginning of the interview. I don't really see myself that way. I have a lot of sympathies for men's rights activists, but I do see myself as an egalitarian. I just have more of a focus on men's issues for various reasons.
Unfortunately, your stuff has been covered by the manosphere. Unfortunately. And this is the issue, that you get sucked in. And, I think the purpose of interviews like this is to stick a pin in it so you can say what you actually believe, because I think too many people do. It's so funny because I've been called an MRA by radical feminists, and I've been called a radical feminist by, I don't like the term men's rights activist in these, in these environs, because it's not, when you say what rights are at issue here, there isn't really a good answer. It's a backlash to a backlash to a backlash to a backlash that goes all the way back to suffrage.
There's a few things that really have some gravitas, I think, like parental rights, like circumcision.
And I mean, those are complicated issues, because right there you get into courts advocating for the child versus courts advocating for the spouse. And with circumcision, you get into religious freedom and parental rights. And
I was just about to say, but these are really complicated issues that are going to require a lot of discussion.
Yeah. And I mean,
you can't have the discussion.
That's the thing. I mean, it's funny because it's almost like, to me, one of those issues steps on the other. If you're arguing for parental rights in custody cases, then you cannot take away a parent's right to choose to circumcise a child, because I know the body autonomy argument, but then you get into vaccinations, and then you get, like, a parent cannot do anything without the state approving it if we go down that road. And
the main thing for me is the male suicide rate and men's mental health issues, because I've experienced that system directly, and I know it doesn't serve men. So that,
like, to me, I agree with you that I think is the starting point, because that's about shame. And when we talk about, sexual assault, it's really a discussion about shame. And when we talk about suicide and sort of what drives men to be more successful, I hate saying successful at suicide, because it's a huge community failure to me when something like that happens. But, women are more likely to attempt suicide, men are more likely to die by suicide, and there are reasons for that.
Yeah.
That you unpack it, it's like, well, this, there's no magic here, there's no confusion. It's a fairly, I won't say simple, but it's a fairly, the data is there.
It's simple in that it's simple to understand. I mean, the difference is so stark and big that you can point at that and you can say, okay, here is definitely a problem, something that needs to be addressed, something we can look at, hopefully we can talk about and have common ground on.
And I really, the more I explore this thing, it seems like people are arguing the same things through this trauma-based bias of, look, you guys want the same things. You want people to be treated equally, whether it's in the legal system, whether it's in the medical system, whether it's just how circles of friends respond to emotion. You're wanting, what is interesting to me is that it seems that the definitions of equality aren't necessarily the same, that people are just, it's that adversarial system, right, that we're sort of stuck in, that everybody sort of advocates to their side, and the person who makes the best argument gets the ruling in their favor instead of seeking compromise. But about the suicide issue, because this sort of ties in to the browbeating you've taken. What would you like people to know about that issue?
Well, I'm in the UK, so I can't speak to the state of mental health provision in other countries. But I had to go in through the National Health Service here. Now, I'm a big supporter of the National Health Service. I think it's a wonderful thing. I wouldn't change it for the world. But any health system works on triage, basically. They have to treat whatever's the most important, and they only have a limited amount of money. Mental health issues are not something you can snap your fingers and fix. They are long-term and they are expensive, which means provision for mental health care just simply isn't there without increasing the budget. And it tends to have the character of a kind of one-size-fits-all system. And that system seems to be very much weighted in favor of women. I've been on a couple of podcasts with male psychiatrists. I privately saw a therapist who specialized in male issues, and they've all said the same kind of things to me. That, well, for one thing, in talk therapy, it takes men longer to open up. So
because of the social pressures,
So if you give a woman a half-hour session, you give a man a half-hour session to talk about their problems, the woman's going to get much more out of it. Obviously, I'm broad brushing, not all, But
nothing you're saying doesn't make sense. I mean, I'm sitting here going, "Wow, the gendering of society goes that deep."
Yeah. So the point is, women will get more out of that session because they will go in and they will open up straight away and they'll be able to talk about things, whereas the therapist tends to have to kind of lead the man into speaking, get him to loosen up, and by then half the session's gone. So there's that much gender difference. Also, the NHS only really offered cognitive behavior therapy, which I don't know why, but my therapist had told me that for some reason that's less effective on men as well, apparently. But there's not much choice for other forms of therapy, at least not through national health systems. So I was lucky in that I could afford to go private and see a guy for a while.
Now, what did you find worked? Methodology?
Well, from CBT, I did take a couple of things. There's some intellectualization processes where you kind of work through your feelings on a chart.
But you were already doing that.
I was already kind of doing that, but formalizing the process really helped me. And then the private therapist I saw, what do you call it? Humanistic therapy, but there were other
person-centered therapy. Okay.
He was taking me through, step by step. Why do you feel this way? What are these things? What can we do about it? And we would make sort of behavioral contracts, promises that I would.
So the CBT came back at the end, but
came back at the end a bit, yeah.
Now, I know this is really personal, but all of this is personal, and I really appreciate you being so candid. do you feel like that worked for you because someone was finally validating your right to have emotions?
I'm not a conventional kind of manly man, masculine dude, particularly, despite the beard. So, I've always been the kind of arty little nerd in the corner. I'm used to get the piss taken out of me for being feminine and effeminate in some way.
So every reaction you had was wrong in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah. So I used to be, as a little kid, I was very emotional. But then I kind of learned through my teens to sort of armor up.
Yep.
And not betray any emotion, and not to let anything get to me ever. And to an extent, that was really useful, really helpful.
But then it all rattles around because when things do get through, there's nowhere for it to go.
Eventually, you just can't bottle it up. You can't stay stoic anymore. But because I had been treated as being, not masculine, being the weak nerd who didn't like sport and whatever, I really pinned a huge amount of my masculine identity on being stoic, on being able to take anything that the world threw at me and just let it wash over.
Because that was the part of the archetype you could achieve.
Yeah, that was like the one thing I could do.
And it's funny because, again, we're getting back to romantic tradition. That wasn't always the case with masculinity. I mean, in the time of, Lord Byron is the big, everything was all over the place. I mean, you watch, this fourth cycle of Blackadder, it's like, damn it, you fool, can't you see we're dying? And all that stuff. I mean, ideal masculinity and ideal femininity has changed through time. And that's why it's interesting to me. And I experienced on the other side of the coin as well. Because I don't have those traditional, feminine. I don't want to talk it out. I don't want to vent over Cosmos. I don't want to do bleh, I want to play a video game and punch things in the face. That's what makes me feel better.
But as well as the processes, what really finally helped me was I had this therapist. He was completely non-judgmental. I could go in there almost like a confessional and I could spill my guts. And there was no sense of being judged or held up to any particular standard.
He must have said something, though. So I'm saying this so that I can learn, because based on the conversations I've had, this is not unique within gaming. I think what you are describing is the norm. So what response helped? What is the right thing to say to a guy who is expressing his feelings and is therefore emotionally vulnerable?
Just to listen, I think. I think lots of men are used to listening rather than being listened to necessarily, and what really helped me also was to have concrete goals. We would make these contracts, something you could do. I mean, when I was first diagnosed with depression, I made this big list of things I could do to minimize stress and so on. And I worked through that list, and that was great until I ran out of things to do.
Because you're seeing the progress.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think that sort of goal-oriented therapy was really useful. I do just want to say quickly, stoicism isn't bad.
No.
It's a good thing. I think this is something I stumble into when people start talking about toxic masculinity, because you look at the traits that they're describing as toxic, and they can be good.
Such as
stoicism. If you can withstand to a certain degree,
that's on the list.
What's thrown at you, that's good. But when you take it too far, like I did, where you don't ever express any emotion or feeling, and you just bottle up and bottle up and bottle up until you crack, that's the point at which it becomes toxic. And you can look at what they call male violence. Being ready to defend your friends and family. Like
male on male violence? You're talking, not like domestic violence?
Yeah, not like domestic violence. Okay. So, having that capacity, that willingness to step up and defend your friends and family, whether it be verbally, which is now called violence as well, or whatever other way, that can be a good thing. But lashing out all the time and expressing your emotions through violence, that's where it becomes toxic. So I tend to see what worries me is that the whole trait is being treated as toxic, like stoicism, but there's a degree, there's an extent to which it can be a good thing.
Yeah.
It's
So
when it goes too far that's bad.
What are guys allowed to do now? Like, what is has every box just sort of been systematically eliminated? Like, is this the issue here?
Like I said, I never really was a conventional, dude, really.
Like, what does that even mean? Like, you belch and fart and talk about boobs? Like, I'm sure you like boobs fine. Like,
yeah, boobs are great.
Yeah.
I love boobs. Boobs are awesome.
I mean, you got the Grand Theft Auto poster in the background. Yeah. I guess that's what you mean? Like, is that...
I'm trying to think. Sport was always the thing that I saw as masculine, but I just couldn't get into it. I was bored.
Yeah.
So that was, that whole kind of struggle and fitness thing never really appealed to me, but I always saw that as masculine.
And I always find that so funny because every time I watch, football, like football in your neck of the woods, not over here where feet don't touch the ball much. Not, yeah. But they're crying all the time. They're crying all the time, and they're held up in these paragons of masculinity. And I'm like, count down to them crying in the interview. They're more like pop idols than our, hand egg players over here, which are very much, walls of meat with scowls.
I'm pretty old, as you can tell by the grey in my beard. So back when the kind of my peer group was into football, it wasn't the kind of European someone touched your leg, scream and fall over.
The flop, okay. So it was
that's
a different,
relatively new, but
yeah, because that's what I find so funny is like athletes are seen as these paragons, and maybe they get more license because they've checked they've gotten those man points, so they don't have to engage in the stoicism.
Man points is a good way to put it. I think there's things you can do to earn man points, and once you're past a certain amount, then you're a man.
You beat enough things with sticks, you're allowed to show emotions, sort of thing. Yeah. That's that's.
I can't even change a tire.
And I think most people can't nowadays. Like, cars are not designed to do that anymore. I used to work at a car dealership. I know they do that to make you come in and pay to fix it. They don't want people fixing it in their driveway anymore. But it's funny. It's those touchstones have definitely, and I can see a lot of people watching this and really identifying with this issue, with not knowing how to be accepted as both an individual and sort of a member of the,
Yeah, I mean, we're having trouble right now defining what masculinity even is.
Yeah.
And that's a big part of the problem, I think. How is any guy supposed to know what masculinity is?
Yeah.
Femininity has been redefined and opened up and worked on for, 50 years more?
But the definition was there that whole thing about if something has no signifiers, then it's by default male, and you throw all these, like a bow on the head or lipstick or something like those are feminine signifiers. Femininity can be crafted. It can be like built on. You can put on lipstick and wear makeup. Oh, that's feminine. But it's almost like, this whole thing of, the default is masculine, but there are pitfalls to that. Like, if it's the default, well, how do you define the default? The default is the default. There's nothing deviating from the norm that you can go, that is, it's how do you define a dog? Not a cat kind of issue. And it's very interesting that, and I mean, this is the funny thing about my gender studies education compared to, it seems like, everybody else on the bloody planet that we kind of dealt with in literature, because that's how I came into it. It was a literature program. It was like, well, this is a story about a boy is assumed. But then, so we never really break down, okay, define boy.
Yeah.
It's just, this is a story about a boy. And that this might be a thing about gaming, that it's real easy to go, well, that's female, well, that's female, well, that's female. okay, we have the bald space marine. We kind of all know that. But when you get into, your line of work with the Ponzi elf boys and do dwarf women have beards, all bets are off. And that's what I liked so much about it. Like, I was kind of disappointed that, Fourth Ed came out and the dwarf women didn't have beards, because I kind of liked that element of it. They were kind of hot in a way that was disappointing to me, because I kind of like the idea that where the races were hot meant something different. But I think we've sort of unpacked to an extent the complexity of the problem. How do you know if you've scored a goal if you can't find the goalpost?
Yeah, and it's not like people tell you when you've done something right either, when you're designing or working.
That is something I feel very strongly about changing in gaming, because you do need to tell people what they're doing right. Like, I've said to a few people, okay, what did you like? You've just told me 5 things that you couldn't stand, and I understand but why did you watch to the end? You just watched 4 hours of content this week. What held you? What did you like? And when you ask them, sometimes they can find something, but we're so fixated on criticism as opposed to critique. Yeah. And we were always spanked for that, right? It was always you had to say something positive about a work to show you had a bench line, that it wasn't just an attack. It was actually, a rational critique of it. And sorry, go ahead.
I've noticed for myself that it upsets me that I don't get more positive feedback, when I do something good.
That's but there's normal.
There's nothing I can do about that for me, So what I've decided to do is to just make sure I devote more time to telling people who've done things that I love what they've done.
That's all you can really do. I can relate to that a lot. I mean, I admit, I saw, Monster Manual 5, cool. Munchkins, cool. Like, you've done some cool stuff. And I know it's easy to lose sight of that because you're just deluged by it. But, I mean, those are achievements that nobody can take away from you. And I think that's awesome.
Thank you.
And, people have to have a certain body of work to be worth interviewing. And it's like, oh, this is very neat. I mean, I could talk to you just about Munchkin for ages, but that's a little, like, again, inside baseball. But yeah, I think you're right. I think that there's certainly, even the gatherings, be it Gen Con or GDC or even E3 to an extent, they have a very negative thrust. The media is looking to break the games. The panels are about what new horror is on the horizon for this industry. It's all... Yeah. And sorry, go ahead.
I've pretty much stopped going to conventions.
Because of that?
Because I used to go and sell, and I used to do quite well, but I don't... this is going to sound SJWE, but I don't feel safe at conventions anymore.
I don't think that's SJWE. I think based on your experiences, you never know when somebody's going to come up and start giving you grief.
Yeah, and the whole atmosphere of conventions has changed as well. Well, this will take a minute to explain, but...
Go for it.
Right. Anti-harassment policies.
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, I think harassment is a bad thing. But there's been this push to bring in these anti-harassment policies, but quite often in the text of them, it's not really anything to do with harassment. It's kind of like a Trojan horse for bringing in censorship, and they often talk about family-friendly displays, and they talk about cosplay must be decent, whatever decent is.
They're trying to cut out offensiveness, not harassment. Yeah.
I mean, I was at a convention 2-3 years ago, and they just brought in this policy, which was basically cribbed directly from the Geek Feminism Wiki one.
Okay.
It's been used lots of places. So I'm sat there with a few friends, and we open up the convention pamphlet, and we look over the rules, and then we went round and we looked at all the stalls and everything that people had on display and the people that were cosplaying and everything, and we cross-checked it against the rules. And if anyone had chosen to be a finicky ass about the rules of the convention, there would be no convention. It would be down to like 10% of the size it was.
Yeah.
Fortunately, no one decided to be a dick. But
those rules are always subjective, and they always cover the ass of the convention. It's preventing lawsuits more than anything, those codes of conduct. It's so...
But it's understandable, but like I say, all it takes is one person to be a dick about it, and you've lost all your money invested in attending the convention. You lose your sales. You probably have reputational damage.
And the convention doesn't understand. It's not easy when you decide to remove anybody. I mean, no matter what your rules are, the minute it hits the internet, and it always does, then everything becomes the world's biggest small town, and everybody has an opinion on the thing. And it's not acceptable to say, I don't know, I wasn't there.
Yeah.
I got in a lot of trouble because something happened in Canada. It's a very big country, and it happened like 5 provinces away, but I don't know, I wasn't there was not an acceptable answer. It's like, that's a cop-out, you're hedging, you're dodging. It's like, I wasn't there.
Yeah, and even if you just point out a flaw in an accusation, you're not necessarily overturning it, but you're just maybe saying, oh, let's wait for more information, or that doesn't sound right, or whatever. You're taken to be
victim
the
blaming.
devil.
Yeah, it's I think everybody wants... These are very serious issues, and I don't for a second believe that you disagree on that point. It's just you're never going to have 100% compliance. And I'm talking as someone who, I stopped going to conventions, big conventions, unless I was working them, because somebody always grabbed my ass. Somebody always, some guy grabbed the chain on my Leia bikini and just yank it. Like, on what planet do you think that's a good idea? And then, the other side, radio guys had come by who are like normies and put some clothes on. There are kids around. And of course, kids are going, hi, Princess Leia, and things like that. And it just, that isn't fun. Like, it's submitting yourself to hazing, and you don't get to join a team at the end. It's foolish. And it just seems like the industry doesn't know how to have fun because we can't define fun. Yeah.
I've been groped at a con too.
Yeah, well, this is funny. This is something that became a topic of conversation on Twitter this morning, yesterday, the day before morning, by the time this airs. But the framework on groping is very different for men and women, and I think it causes discomfort in different ways. Yeah. And it was a very interesting conversation because guys were like, I was creeped out because somebody grabbed me, but I didn't feel like I could say anything. Yeah. And I completely understand why a guy would feel hesitant to complain about that, even though I think it's completely inappropriate, and I think guys should be able to go, hey, and I come at it from, the position of somebody who's been married for quite a while, and women have groped my husband, and he tells them they're married, and they don't care. Yeah. It's like, oh, she can come too. It's like, that's not the point. Like, that is a nice way of saying, don't do that again. Yeah. And that is the only way a guy, well, not the only way, but pretty much the only way a guy can complain is to say, please, no, I'm married. That's something you can say. Or I'm gay or something like that. Yeah, like you can't say, please don't do that. There has to be some reason why it isn't just a default. No, I don't want to be touched right now. Thank you.
Yeah. And rejecting someone and hurting their feelings isn't easy either.
Does that go through your head? Like, I'm going to hurt this woman's feelings if I tell her, don't grab my junk? Like,
yeah, I can't speak for every guy, but it goes through my head. I don't want to hurt anyone, really.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh? Because I don't think it's about that at that point. It's like, it's one thing if like sometimes people just brush by and it's an accident, but we're not talking about that. I mean, I've seen it. Girls go up to guys and they get handsy. I have seen it. And it's at the point where I am more cautious, even touching someone on the arm now. I'm worried about, is that appropriate? Is that not appropriate? You know,
Yeah.
and this is something 3 to 5 years ago I wouldn't get. It's an arm. Like,
Yeah. Same here. That's just how intense and weird the whole
yeah.
situation's gotten. You know, that you shouldn't double take about tapping someone on the shoulder to get their attention.
Well,
And yet you find yourself, maybe
Yeah.
I won't. Sort of.
and it used to be like that's how you controlled a room as a host, or if you were, you know, in a LARP, a bit of a touch on an arm with somebody who has these giant things on their head, they can't hear you. It's the only way to
Yeah.
get their attention. And I was in a thing of, why is she touching people? It's like, I'm not assaulting you, man. It's to get your attention because you're about to hit the person behind you with your giant foam broadsword, you know,
Yeah.
like, but there is definitely this, and I mean, you can trigger someone quite badly if they're autistic and you touch
Yeah.
them without them being ready for it as well. And I don't think these are things I feel should be umbrellaed into this discussion. And it seems to just crater on who has the right to complain.
Yeah. I mean, we used to cope with all this stuff fine. I mean, from what I've seen, the makeup of the community hasn't actually changed very much. I see pretty much the same number of women. I see pretty much the same number of minorities.
You know what it is for me? Back in the day, if someone grabbed my ass, I could turn around and smack them.
Yeah.
And everybody would be okay with that. Now you can't do that because that's an assault charge.
Mm.
And so I have absolutely no way to handle that. I don't want to go and make a complaint and take half my day and have 4 people involved. And I mean, I'm speaking from experience here, as this person was inappropriate. Fill out this report. Oh, you gotta be kidding me. And then they talk to them. And then you're out at the convention and somebody on a walkie-talkie finds you and says, you need to come back because they have said this. Nobody wants to do that.
Yeah. I mean, we had someone get handsy at a vampire LARP. I used to run vampire LARPs as part of the Camarilla organization.
That happens at vampire LARPs.
Yeah, you know, six guy. Well, if it's you know, mutual and consensual, no problem. But this guy, it wasn't. So six burly guys in leather took him to one side and had a very intense chat with him, and he never did it again. You can't do that.
But nowadays, it's I felt intimidated. I was bullied. If you do that, and they don't leave out. They leave out what they did to, you know, set off that 6 guys, taking them to the side and say, hey, there's no ability for a community to self-police anymore, because then someone just goes on the internet and then everybody on the planet has a say on whether it was right or wrong based on partial information.
Yeah, I mean, again, we're running into things where I think all sides can agree, like harassment at conventions is wrong, but we disagree on what to do about it. Like,
and what it is.
Yeah, and what it is. Yeah, what constitutes harassment.
Yeah.
You know, one side wants to bring in all these extra restrictive rules and so on, and the other side just says, well, if it happens, we'll deal with it using the tools at our disposal, case by case, you know?
It's so ridiculous that some people complain, because my policy when I ran conventions, it's like, it doesn't matter what it is. If someone told you to stop and someone heard them tell you to stop and you did it again, you broke the rules. It is that simple.
Yeah.
But people complained that they shouldn't have to tell someone to stop. They should know it's wrong. And they were too intimidated to tell them to stop. And, you know, my attitude was, well, there is a certain personal accountability to use your words and be assertive, because otherwise, especially when you have a room full of neuroatypical people and they see, you know, the gaggle of polyamory people who always seems to show up at hotel conventions, and they're doing all this stuff, and then they say, oh, this is just normal for this. And no, it's not. It gets complicated very quickly. And yeah, I'm really surprised that we are in a post-accountability era where people are not, and I don't want to even touch the the yes means yes consent laws, like the affirmative consent things. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, that can you please not say that? Can you please not call me that? Can you not do it? I don't like it. That should be enough.
You say something like that and people will accuse you of victim blaming.
That's right.
Because you're putting some of the onus on someone to look after themselves and to take the steps necessary to make sure they're safe and so on. But at some point, I mean, no system is perfect. You can't have security guys everywhere watching everybody all the time, can you?
But the other thing is they have an issue. And perhaps I'm being judgmental here. Perhaps there is an element I don't understand. But people have an issue telling one person, stop doing that, please. But they have no issue going on the internet and blogging about it and blasting them in front of the entire world, naming names and locations and all that stuff. I don't see how that's better. Like, that is going to just... You never gave the person an opportunity to make it right. And now they can never make it right because it's just gone. It's broken containment and it's just gone out to the chattering classes.
Yeah, and like this case with the airline groping that was on Twitter today.
Yeah, or the whole don't do that, the whole elevator gate thing that I thought was fairly innocuous. That is another thing I was really surprised got so huge.
Yeah.
So what if somebody doesn't think I should get into an elevator? Big freaking deal. But it was a big deal to some people. And
huge deal.
Huge. And
enormous.
It just seems to be sparks that hit dry straw. And there's an element of, it doesn't really make any sense.
Yeah.
It's just right outrage, right time.
And the thing about Elevator Gate was, that was the atheist and skeptic, the rationalist community, and it blew up enormously in a community that you'd think would be able to distance itself and work through it logically, and it absolutely couldn't.
People are people, right?
Yeah.
People are people, and I don't think that being a rationalist, being a skeptic, and I mean, I read Skeptic Magazine and all that stuff. I find it interesting. It's, I'm a religious person, but I find the viewpoint interesting. It challenges me. But just because somebody doesn't believe in formal religion doesn't mean they don't have ideologies that they can be very rigid.
That's what that whole incident really brought home.
Right. Yeah, there was no tiebreaker on these other vaguely Marxist influences in the whole thing. And we're dropping a lot of trigger words in this conversation. It's going to be very, very interesting. It's good that it kind of went long because only the truly devoted will complete the path and get to the real talk. But I want you to have the last word because I really do appreciate that you really laid it on the line. Like, you've talked about some really personal stuff, and I hope people, for me, what I hope people take away from this interview is don't judge people based on a blog post that is simply a snapshot of the person at that time in a heightened state. That's what because obviously you're a thoughtful, sensitive, creative, intelligent person. And
you make me blush.
Hey, you said you don't get enough compliments, man. Come on, I'm starting it.
Possibly because I'm terrible at taking compliments.
Well, because you're a stoic and compliments inherently break stoicism. You have to say thank you for something instead of just, But yeah, I get it. But that's what I hope people take away. What, if you could get one message across and just make it stick, what would it be?
Take the time to really try and understand what people are saying and what they mean. If you get angry immediately or you're not sure, just ask. I think if everyone just took that one extra step to at least try and, you don't have to agree with someone to understand their point of view. And if everyone just took that extra step, I think that would be one thing we could all do to make things better.
That's sort of what they call intentional dialogue. Is my understanding is you mean this, is that right?
Yeah.
Just that step.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would solve a lot of issues. Okay, James Desborough, everybody, thank you very much. Also known as Grim. James, how can we find your work and for people to buy your books, not pirate them? That makes me so mad. That I'm still stuck on that. Can you tell? Like, hopefully a few people will buy it just to write the scales or something. Like, hell, I might even do it. But how do people find your product?
My main website is postmortemstudios.wordpress.com. That links to pretty much everything else. You can find me on DriveThruRPG and RPG Now if ebooks are your thing. Lulu if you like print. I've got some fiction and stuff up on Amazon. I've started doing audiobooks too. I'm not telling you where to find my erotica because I write that under a pen name. So
because everybody does. You'd be surprised how many writers do that because it's easy, quick money.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, James, thank you so much.